Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here with you today. And before I talk about the issue of rights, I think it's important that we share experiences. And for me, I am definitely there. And it's interesting because, as we said, every woman has a different experience. Our bodies are different, just the same way when we menstruate, we have different symptoms, we have different challenges. So mine began in a very interesting manner. I had started having challenges both at home and at work, especially with this symptom called brain fog. And it got to the stage where I was feeling utter panic. I was convinced that I either had the onset of Alzheimer's or early dementia. And I went to see a doctor. Actually, I actually went out to actually check what was wrong with me. I had a battery of tests, MRI, CAT scans. I had a physiometric test. I had blood tests. And finally, a team of 3 doctors, a neurologist and a psychiatrist and another doctor, all looking at my brain and behavior, said, it is menopause. There is nothing wrong with your brain. You do not have Alzheimer's. You do not have dementia. You are simply going through what many women go through, and it is called menopause. However, as brain doctors, we don't deal with that, so you need to go and see a doctor about your menopause. So I came back to Kenya, relieved that I'm not about to die, and in search of a medical practitioner who specializes in menopause. Now, in Kenya, that is a difficult find. You find most gynecologists are focusing on childbirth, that area of reproductive health, but the reproductive health for more senior citizens like ourselves is far and in between. Also, in Africa, we don't seem to be benefiting from the advances of medical protocols or the medicine that can help us. When we talk about HRT, we are still talking about the old, I don't know how to put it in medical terms, but anyway, I discovered a new form, which is a gel, which you just dab on your hand and you go for the day. There's no swallowing, there's no... So what has happened, there are advances out there which would make life easier for women, but in Africa, one, we do not seem to have access to those developments, advanced developments, and 2, how expensive is it? So as we engage our policymakers, and I was just telling Dr. Serem that I'm very glad to see him here, we have to be able to engage them on the issue of cost as well. It's in the same vein that we did engage policymakers when we were talking about the cost of sanitary towels. And Kenya was the first country to zero-rate sanitary towels so that they could be affordable for women and girls who menstruate. I think that we have gone back, we've rolled back a little bit on that. Now there is a bit of taxation on sanitary towels, but that is the engagement we need to have also around menopause. How do we make sure that the women, both in urban and rural areas, have access to medicines or to treatments that can alleviate their symptoms without it being so costly? So Dr. Serem, we are looking to you and your team, and let us know how we can help you in terms of lobbying on this issue. I also found I had another challenge because I'm an older mom. So I had my children very late in life. And so I am undergoing menopause when I have teenagers. And I am telling you, it creates an environment which is undescribable. So I started doing a lot of reading, and I have two books which I bought. I've got several books I have, but there are two that have helped me. One is called, where did I put this? It's called Menopause versus Puberty. It's by an author called Tomalisa Lampkin. And it just tells you how you're going to deal as a mother with menopause, with children who are of the age of puberty. And it has really helped because I think my children used to think I was a total terrorist. But now, having recognized that my children are undergoing hormonal changes, undergoing hormonal changes, and this book has helped me with that transition. I think perhaps we are not completely in the we're not completely in the democratic space in my home, but it has helped. So also information for women is something that is there. And I was just listening to the previous speaker talking about how we talk about our mothers-in-laws and even mothers. And I remember distinctly, the first time I used the word terrorist was describing my mother. But now when I think about it, surely she must have been undergoing menopause and this is, but the society then didn't understand, didn't want to know. And again, as we have this conversation, we have to, and I'm so glad that there are so many men in this room, because we have to bring our male partners on board. When I was in Parliament dealing with sanitary towels, the difficulty was initially how men did not want to be involved in what they call a women's issue. Yet, it was an issue that impacted men differently, but the campaign around the sanitary towels showed us how we need to engage with men. Yesterday, when I was leaving the Judges Colloquium, because that's where I came from, in Mombasa, and my colleagues in the Supreme Court were inquiring, why would you leave the Judges Colloquium? What meeting is this you're going for? So I said, I'm going to a meeting on menopause. And my male colleagues looked at me and said, a conference? He says, why do you women have to discuss these things in a conference? And those women's things. And I said, no, your wives will have menopause, your daughters will have menopause, your mothers will have menopause. And therefore, in fact, I'm going to represent you at this conference. But we need to engage them because I normally say, and I've always said this, men and women, we are equal, but we are different. It's very hard for men to understand what is going on in our bodies. And you know the way the symptoms bring themselves. Brain fog, sweating, we are unable to sleep at night. So in the morning when we go to work, we are sleepy. And everyone who doesn't understand thinks we are lazy, we are bad-tempered, we are unreasonable. But I think if this information and education is out there, I think it will be easier to deal with. Anyway, let me now come back. I talked about, I said that there are two books I'd like to recommend. For older moms, The Menopause versus Puberty. And then there is another one which I've read which has been helpful called Making Friends with Menopause by Sarah Rayner. Because you have to make a friend with this thing. It invades your body, you have to accept it, and then you have to say, let's live together with it. Obviously, in Africa, it is important that we start looking at the legal and constitutional frameworks to deal with menopause. And we must do so because menopause is a reproductive health issue. And I'm happy to say that in terms of a constitutional framework, Kenya would be one of the countries leading in Africa in terms of the provisions that we find within the Constitution. For example, in Kenya, we have a very clear provision in Article 27 on the right to equality and the rights to equal opportunity, and the rights not to be discriminated against on the basis of sex, on the basis of gender, on the basis of health status. This is something that applies to public institutions and private institutions, so that even under employment, a company ought to have a policy to ensure that those employees that are undergoing menopause are not discriminated against. We also have in our Constitution, under Article 28, the right to human dignity, the right to be treated as a human, for your dignity to be respected. Under Article 41, we have a whole section on labor practices and how we have the right to work and that working conditions should be reasonable. And reasonability ought to be tested against what are the symptoms of menopause and how should you contribute. Should, for example, we be talking about flexi hours, the same that nursing mothers get, should that be applied to also women who have menopause? These are the conversations we need to have. Of course, Article 43 speaks directly to the right to health, including reproductive health. Our Constitution goes further to provide for the protection of persons with disabilities. Sometimes, not all, menopause can result in a debilitating disability. And therefore, those whose symptoms are that bad can claim their rights as persons with disabilities. And finally, we also have Article 57, which protects older members of society, to assure that older members of society can integrate into society and they can access the same rights as those who are not older. Again, menopause is largely related to women who are older. This is a right that we can claim under the Constitution. Finally, we have under our Constitution, under Article 35, the right to information, and under Article 43, the right to education. Both these rights should be claimed. The stigma that women undergo, that they cannot talk about it. They cannot talk about menopause. You see, the shock when people realize we're having a conference to talk about menopause is all about the stigma around it. Why should we talk about it? Why are we talking about it publicly? And women themselves, therefore, are suffering, but because of the stigma, they are not coming out to seek help, to get medical attention, or even to claim their rights at work. Therefore, the rights, as provided under the Kenyan Constitution, but in Africa, those rights are clearly stipulated in international conventions and treaties. Those rights are ours, and those rights can be claimed. However, there is need for the translation of those rights into implementation. And this is where we must engage governments to ensure health policies, educational policies, information policies are engaged so as to include menopause as a subject matter. We need to be able to engage our parliamentarians and to see whether it is possible to engage in legal reform under the employment law regime. But I also think we actually need to move to claim. A lot of people always ask, why don't you judges make pronouncements on the rights? But as judges, we can only make those pronouncements if you come to the courts and move us with a claim, and then we can make the declaration. And I think perhaps it is time for those who are involved in public interest litigation, and there are those I recognize in this room, to work around the issue of menopause and let us have it declared firmly as a right that is owned, firmly so that employers do not discriminate against women who are undergoing menopause. And as Africa is having this conversation, I would be glad, Dr. Serem, I would be glad if Kenya would lead. Thank you very much.